7 warning signs your memory loss is more than normal aging. Most people believe that forgetting things is simply what happens when we get older, something to laugh off and move past without a second thought. But that belief isn't entirely true, and in some cases, it can quietly delay something that truly deserves attention. This video is for educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical evaluation, diagnosis, or advice. And if anything here resonates with your own experience or the experience of someone you love, the most helpful next step is always a conversation with a qualified healthcare professional. Here's what makes this topic so easy to misunderstand. Normal aging does change the brain, names take a little longer to surface, keys get misplaced more often than they used to, reading glasses seem to grow legs of their own. These small slips are usually harmless, part of a nervous system that has simply been running for many decades, gathering decades of experiences, faces, dates, and details along the way. But there is a smaller category of memory changes that behave differently, that show up in a distinct pattern, and that many families don't recognize until much later than they wish they had. Today we are going to walk through 7 of those signs, one at a time, explained in plain language so you know exactly what to look for and why it matters. We'll also talk about why these signs are so easy to miss, how they differ from the ordinary forgetfulness everyone experiences, and what steps actually make sense if you notice them in yourself or in someone you love. And stay with us until the end, because the 7th sign is one that even experienced caregivers often miss entirely, simply because it doesn't look like a memory problem at all. Before we go further, it helps to understand the difference between forgetting and something else entirely. Forgetting is when the memory is there, just temporarily out of reach. You forget a name at a party, and 20 minutes later, while you're driving home, it pops back into your head completely unprompted. That's normal. That's simply how retrieval works, and it happens to people of every age, not only older adults. What we're discussing today is different. It involves information that doesn't just feel hard to retrieve, it seems to have never fully registered in the first place. The memory isn't misplaced somewhere in the mind waiting to resurface. In many cases, it was never properly stored to begin with. That distinction is subtle, but once you understand it, the rest of these signs will make a lot more sense, and you'll start to see why doctors ask such specific questions when evaluating memory concerns. It's also worth mentioning early on that many things can mimic these signs without being related to any serious underlying condition. Poor sleep, dehydration, certain medications, thyroid imbalances, vitamin deficiencies, chronic stress, and even undiagnosed depression can all create memory difficulties that look strikingly similar to what we're about to describe. This is actually good news because many of those causes are treatable, sometimes completely reversible, once they're properly identified. That's exactly why we keep coming back to one central message throughout this video, that noticing these signs is not the same as diagnosing yourself or anyone else. It's simply the first step toward asking the right questions. It's also worth noting how common these concerns actually are, so you understand why this conversation matters to so many families, not just a small handful. Researchers estimate that memory-related conditions affect a significant and growing portion of older adults worldwide, and many experts believe a substantial percentage of cases go unrecognized for months or even years before anyone seeks an evaluation. That gap between when signs first appear and when someone finally speaks with a professional is exactly the space this video is trying to help close. Let's start with the first one. Number 1, repeating the same question within a short period of time. Almost everyone repeats a question occasionally, especially when they're distracted, tired, or juggling too many things at once. That alone means very little, and it happens across every age group without any cause for concern. What is more meaningful is when the same question gets asked several times within a single conversation, or across a single afternoon, with no apparent awareness that it was already asked and answered just minutes earlier. Consider Dorothy, a 78-year-old retired schoolteacher known throughout her family for her sharp memory and her love of trivia nights. Her daughter began noticing something unusual during a single phone call. Dorothy asked what time her granddaughter's flight was landing, received a clear answer, chatted about the weather for a few minutes, and then asked the exact same question again, using nearly identical wording with the same tone of genuine curiosity as before. A few minutes later, she asked it a third time. It wasn't that Dorothy forgot the flight time the way anyone might forget a small detail during a busy day. It seemed as though the answer simply hadn't stayed with her at all, as if each time she heard it, the information touched the surface and slipped away without ever settling in. This pattern may be associated with difficulty forming new short-term memories, which is different from simply misplacing information you already have stored. Occasional repetition, especially when someone is stressed, overwhelmed, or not sleeping well, is common and usually nothing to worry about. Everyone has had a long week where they asked a coworker the same question twice because their mind was elsewhere. But when repetition becomes frequent, happens within the same short conversation, and shows no recognition on the person's part that they've already asked, it may be worth discussing with a doctor who can look at the fuller picture of a person's health, including sleep quality, medications, and overall cognitive function, before drawing any conclusions. What makes this particular sign so useful for families to understand is the timing involved. Ordinary forgetfulness tends to stretch across days or weeks, the kind of thing where you might ask your spouse the same question you asked a week earlier because life has been busy. The pattern we're describing here compresses into minutes, sometimes even seconds, within a single sitting. That compressed timing is often what first prompts a family member to gently mention the pattern to a doctor, rather than continuing to assume it's simply a byproduct of a busy or distracted mind. Number 2, getting lost in familiar places. Getting turned around in a brand new city, an unfamiliar airport, or a hotel hallway at night is completely normal, and it happens to people of every age. What stands out more is when someone becomes disoriented in a place they have known for years, sometimes for decades. This might look like a person driving to a grocery store they've shopped at for 20 years and suddenly not recognizing which turn to take, or walking through their own neighborhood and feeling unsure which direction leads home, despite having walked that same path hundreds of times before. Take the story of Harold, a 69-year-old man who had lived in the same house for over 30 years, a house he and his late wife had chosen together when they were newlyweds. One evening, he left to walk his dog on a route he had taken thousands of times before, a simple loop around the block he could once have walked with his eyes closed. An hour later, a neighbor found him 2 streets away, calm but clearly unsure of how to get back. Harold wasn't confused about who he was or what he was doing there. He recognized the dog, remembered his own name without hesitation, and could describe his house in detail. He simply could not orient himself in a space that had once felt completely automatic, as though the internal map he had relied on for 30 years had suddenly gone blank. This kind of disorientation may be linked to changes in how the brain processes spatial memory, which is the internal mapping system we rely on without even realizing it, built from years of repeated experience moving through the same environments. A single incident, especially during an unusually stressful week or after a poor night of sleep, doesn't necessarily mean anything serious, and many people experience a moment of confusion here and there without it signaling anything significant. But a pattern of this kind of disorientation, particularly in places someone has known for a long time, is one of the signs that many neurologists consider worth evaluating further, because it often points toward changes in a very specific and well-studied part of brain function. Number 3, difficulty following a conversation or a familiar task. Everyone loses the thread of a conversation now and then, especially in a noisy room, during a long meeting, or when multiple people are talking at once. That's simply attention working the way it always has, and it says nothing meaningful about a person's memory. What's different here is a genuine struggle to follow a conversation that used to be effortless, or losing track of the steps in a task that has been performed the same way for years, like preparing a familiar recipe, following the rules of a favorite card game, or balancing a checkbook. One family described their father, a retired accountant who had spent 40 years working with numbers, suddenly needing to ask basic questions about a tax form he had filled out correctly every single year of his working life. It wasn't that the form had changed, and it wasn't that the rules had become more complicated. The internal roadmap he once used automatically, the sequence of steps that used to flow without conscious thought, no longer felt reliable to him. He would start the form, pause partway through, and ask his daughter questions he clearly used to know the answers to without hesitation. This may indicate a change in what's sometimes called executive function, essentially the brain's ability to organize, sequence, and plan multiple steps toward a goal. Because these mental processes usually run quietly in the background, Almost invisibly, difficulty with them can be easy to miss until a task that once felt automatic suddenly requires real conscious effort or gets abandoned partway through out of frustration or confusion. Family members sometimes describe this as someone simply seeming more tired or less motivated, when in reality, the underlying task itself has become genuinely harder to complete. Before we continue, it's worth pausing to say this clearly one more time. None of these signs on their own confirm anything. The human brain is remarkably complicated, and stress, poor sleep, certain medications, thyroid issues, chronic pain, and even vitamin deficiencies can all create symptoms that closely resemble what we're describing here. That's exactly why a proper medical evaluation matters so much, because many of these causes are treatable once identified, sometimes with something as simple as adjusting a medication or addressing a nutritional gap. Number 4, trouble finding the right words. Nearly everyone experiences the occasional word that sits just out of reach, that familiar feeling of a word being right on the tip of your tongue. That's a universal and completely harmless part of how memory retrieval works, and it happens to people in their 20s just as often as it happens to people in their 70s. What's more notable is when someone frequently substitutes vague, general words for specific ones, calling a watch the hand thing or a refrigerator the cold box, not as a joke or a moment of playful forgetfulness, but because the specific word genuinely isn't accessible to them anymore, no matter how long they search for it. Margaret, a woman in her early 70s who had spent her entire career as a librarian, once known throughout her community for her precise and articulate speech, began describing everyday objects in these roundabout, unusually vague ways. Her husband initially assumed she was simply having a slow day, perhaps distracted by something on her mind. Over several months, though, the pattern became more frequent rather than less, showing up not just with unusual objects but with common, everyday words she had used comfortably her entire life. This may be connected to changes in what's known as language retrieval, a distinct cognitive function from vocabulary itself and separate from general intelligence. Someone can still be sharp, articulate in the structure of their sentences, and completely aware that something feels wrong, while still struggling to access the exact words they need in the moment. Occasional word-finding trouble is extremely common and usually not concerning at all. A consistent and worsening pattern, however, especially one the person themselves finds frustrating or embarrassing, is one that a healthcare provider can help evaluate through a proper cognitive assessment. Number 5, misplacing items in unusual locations and being unable to retrace steps. Everyone misplaces things from time to time. Reading glasses end up in strange places, phones get left in the wrong room, remote controls disappear between couch cushions. That's simply part of being human, and retracing your steps usually solves it within minutes, often with a small laugh at your own expense. What stands out here is a different combination altogether: items showing up in genuinely illogical places, like keys found inside the freezer or a wallet discovered inside a kitchen drawer, paired with a complete inability to retrace the steps that led there. One caregiver described finding her mother's television remote control inside the bathroom cabinet, tucked behind a stack of towels. When asked about it gently, her mother had no memory of putting it there at all, not even a vague sense of having walked into the bathroom while holding it. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't ordinary distraction. The entire sequence of events, the walk from the living room to the bathroom, the decision to place the remote there, seemed to be completely missing from her memory, as if it had simply never happened from her perspective. This pattern may be associated with difficulty forming continuous memories of everyday actions, sometimes described by researchers as a break in the ongoing narrative of a person's day. Misplacing a single item occasionally is completely normal and expected at any age. A repeated pattern, especially one combined with genuine confusion or distress about how the item ended up somewhere so unusual, is one of the signs that clinicians often ask about directly during a cognitive evaluation, precisely because it tends to distinguish ordinary forgetfulness from something that may warrant closer attention. Number 6, withdrawing from hobbies, social activities, or responsibilities. This sign often gets missed entirely, because on the surface, it doesn't look like a memory problem at all. It looks like a personality change, or low mood, or simply someone slowing down naturally with age, choosing a quieter life after decades of being busy. But sometimes withdrawal happens because a person is quietly, perhaps even subconsciously, aware that tasks which once felt easy now feel exhausting, confusing, or embarrassing, and stepping back feels safer than risking a visible mistake in front of people they care about. Robert had played cards with the same group of friends every Thursday night for over 15 years, a tradition he treasured and rarely missed, even during illness or bad weather. Without much explanation, he stopped going, telling his wife he was tired or that he simply didn't feel like it anymore or that the group had gotten boring. It was only months later, during a routine conversation with his doctor, that it became clear Robert had begun losing track of the game's rules, mixing up whose turn it was, and forgetting cards that had already been played, something he found deeply humiliating and preferred to avoid entirely rather than risk being seen struggling in front of lifelong friends. This kind of withdrawal may be tied to an awareness, even an unspoken and unacknowledged one, that certain cognitive tasks have become harder to manage than they used to be. It's important to say clearly that withdrawal by itself has many possible explanations, including depression, grief, chronic pain, or simply changing interests as people age, all of which deserve compassionate attention regardless of the underlying cause. But when withdrawal appears alongside some of the other signs we've already discussed, repeated questions, disorientation in familiar places, or difficulty with once simple tasks, it becomes part of a broader pattern that is genuinely worth exploring with a professional, rather than dismissing as simple preference or personality change. Now we come to the sign we mentioned earlier, the one many families don't recognize until much later, precisely because it doesn't resemble memory loss at all on the surface, and often gets mistaken for something else entirely. Number 7, difficulty recognizing the sequence of recent events. This is one of the more subtle and frequently overlooked signs, and it goes beyond simply forgetting a specific fact or detail. It involves losing track of the order in which recent events actually happened, mixing up whether something occurred yesterday or last week, or genuinely believing a past event just happened recently, sometimes describing it in vivid, convincing detail. It's less about a single missing detail and more about the timeline itself becoming unreliable, as though the internal calendar that organizes our memories has started to lose its structure. Eleanor, an 81-year-old widow known for her warmth and her love of storytelling, began telling her son about a wonderful recent visit from her late sister, describing it in vivid, specific detail: the coffee they drank together, the old photographs they looked through, the particular joke her sister had told that made them both laugh. Her sister had passed away nearly 4 years earlier. Eleanor wasn't confused about who her sister was, and she certainly wasn't being dishonest or trying to deceive anyone. In her own mind, the visit was recent and completely real, because her internal sense of time, the mental filing system that normally tells us what happened when, had lost its usual reliability. This may be linked to disruptions in what researchers sometimes call temporal memory, the brain's ability to place events correctly along an internal timeline. It's considered one of the more significant signs on this list because it often reflects a deeper change in how memories are being organized and stored in the first place, rather than simply how they're being recalled later. Families frequently interpret this kind of moment as confusion, or even mistake it for a vivid imagination or a comforting story someone tells themselves, when in fact it may be one of the clearest signals that a full evaluation with a qualified professional would be genuinely worthwhile, sooner rather than later. So, what should you actually take away from everything we've covered today? These 7 signs: repeating questions within short periods of time, getting lost in once familiar places, struggling to follow conversations or familiar tasks, difficulty finding the right words, misplacing items without any memory of doing so, withdrawing from hobbies and social activities, and losing track of the sequence of recent events are not meant to frighten you, and they're certainly not meant to turn you into an amateur diagnostician for yourself or anyone you love. On their own, each of these signs can have a simple, entirely treatable explanation, and many people who experience one or two of them occasionally go on to live long, healthy lives with no further concern whatsoever. It's the pattern, the frequency, and the way these signs build on one another over time that genuinely matters most, far more than any single isolated moment. Research consistently shows that early evaluation leads to better outcomes and a wider range of available options, which is precisely why paying attention early, rather than waiting until concerns become undeniable, makes such a meaningful difference for both the individual and the people who love them. That single point, that earlier conversations tend to open more doors rather than fewer, is worth remembering long after this video ends. As we mentioned earlier, a substantial percentage of memory-related concerns go unrecognized for a long stretch of time before anyone brings them to a doctor, and closing that gap, even by a few months, can change what options are available. If any of this sounded familiar today, whether about yourself or about someone you care about deeply, the most valuable thing you can do isn't to panic, and it isn't to quietly self-diagnose based on a single video. It's to have an honest, gentle, and unhurried conversation with a doctor who can look at the complete picture, run appropriate evaluations, and rule out the many treatable causes that can closely mimic these very signs. That conversation, however uncomfortable it might feel to start, is almost always easier than the uncertainty of wondering in silence. It can also help to prepare a little before that appointment. Writing down specific examples, the flight time question asked 3 times in one afternoon, the walk that ended 2 streets away from home, the remote control found somewhere it never belonged, gives a doctor far more to work with than a general sense that something feels different lately. Dates, frequency, and small details make these conversations more productive, and they help a healthcare provider tell the difference between ordinary aging and something that deserves a closer look. Bringing a family member along can help too, since they often notice patterns the person experiencing them may not fully recognize in themselves. We'd love to hear from you. Have you noticed any of these signs in someone you love, or perhaps even in yourself, and how did you decide what to do next? Share your experience in the comments below, because your story might be exactly what helps another family recognize something they've been struggling to put into words for months or even years. If this video gave you a clearer understanding of something that once felt confusing or frightening, consider sharing it with someone who might need it today. And subscribe for more videos that turn complicated medical topics into something clear, honest, and genuinely useful for the families who need it most.